So this book is called Cowboys by Marie and Douglas Gorslin. More than 100 years ago, millions of longhorn cattle roamed the Texas plains. There was plenty of grass for them to eat, and they grew strong and healthy. Then the Civil War began. Most of the Texas men went away to fight, and the cattle were left to run wild. After the war ended, people in many parts of the country needed cattle for meat and other products. A Texas rancher who could gather a herd of cattle could get a good price for them. But first he had to take the cattle to market towns like Abilene and Dodge City. The trip north was long and dangerous. A rancher needed strong young men who were good at riding horses to drive the cattle to the market. So he hired a crew of cowboys. The time of the long cattle drives lasted only about 15 years. This is the story of cowboys during the first exciting years of the long drives. The ranchers were the pioneers of the cattle country. Instead of farming the land, they grazed cattle. There were very few schools and churches, and the houses were as many as 50 miles apart. Few women and children lived in cattle country in the early days. Those who did led a rugged and lonely life. A man who decided to raise and sell cattle had to find a spot with plenty of grass and water. He usually built his ranch house near a stream. The house had a kitchen or a mess hall where all the cowboys ate their meals. Nearby was a corral where the horses were trained and a bunkhouse where the cowboys slept. A cowboy's workday started early. The cook and the wrangler were out of the bunkhouse before sunrise. The wrangler was the youngest member of the outfit. He took care of the cowboys' horses. He also helped cook and prepare their meals. Bacon, salt pork, baked beans, and sourdough biscuits, washed down with strong coffee, were some of the things that the cowboys ate. In hot weather, the cowboys usually ate their meals around an open fire. After supper, they usually played cards or dominoes. Some of them worked on repairing their gear, and one of the men usually played music on a fiddle, a mouth organ, or a banjo. But most of the cowboys were so tired at the end of the day that they quickly went to sleep. Because of the hard life, cowboys often looked older than they were. When riding the trail, they spent up to 18 hours a day on horseback in all kinds of weather. The special clothes the cowboy wore were very practical. A wide-brimmed felt hat shielded his face from rain and hot sun. It could also be used as a pail to scoop water from a stream and a pillow to rest on at night. On windy days or during a stampede, a cowboy tied a bandana around his face to keep the dust out of his nose. He also used a bandana to blindfold a frightened horse. Heavy chaps made of leather or animal skins protected the cowboy's legs from thorns and scratchy bushes. Most cowboys did not own much, not even the horses they rode, but every cowboy owned his own saddle. A saddle cost a great deal of money, but it lasted a long time. The cowboys almost always carried a six-shooter. Though it did not shoot very accurately, it could be used to turn back a stampede, blast away a rattlesnake, or stop an angry cow. Rifles were used for hunting wolves or coyotes that might attack the herd. A cowboy changed horses several times a day to keep from wearing his horses out, but he always used the same saddle. The shape of the saddle kept a rider from slipping backwards when his horse stopped short or reared. Cowboy boots had high heels so that the rider's feet would not slip through the stirrups. The high tops kept the dirt and the pebbles out and protected the cowboy's ankles from snake bites. Spurs were used to make a horse move quickly, so the leather was quirt or whip, which most cowboys did not like to use. To catch cattle and horses, cowboys also used a lasso or a lariat, made of strong hemp rope. A roper on horseback kept his lasso tied to his saddle horn. In these illustrations, a cowboy on foot is roping the horse. The slipknot allows him to make the loop any size he wants. He lets out extra line to make the loop large enough to fit around his own horse's head. He whirls the loop in the air and keeps it open. He aims and tosses it over the horse's head. Cowboys rode small, tough Mustangs, often called cow ponies. Mustangs ran wild on the range, so they had to be caught and tamed. A wild horse will buck and kick if anything is put on its back. Bronco busters saddled and bridled the mustangs and cured them of buckings. Cowboys trained a different horse for each special task: night riding, swimming rivers, or working in heavy brush. Though the rancher usually owned the horses, the cowboys were very attached to them. Roundup took place twice a year in spring and fall. Sometimes it lasted for weeks. Since there were no fences on the open range, herds of several different ranches sometimes wandered for miles and miles. They often mingled with each other. Each rancher had a special brand that marked his cattle as his own. At roundup time, his cowboys searched all over the range, gathering his cattle together in bunches. As soon as the cattle had been gathered, the cowboys drove them to their day's camp. This was never easy because cows did not like to be moved from their grazing spots. At the camp, newborn calves and mavericks, strays that had not been branded before, were roped and marked with branding irons. After spring roundup, the drive north to the market began. A drover or trail boss took charge of the herd. He kept careful count of the cattle because several ranchers usually joined the herds for the ride. The trail boss was followed by 6 teams of cowboys who rode around the herd, guiding and prodding the cattle along the trail. The first few days of the long ride, the men drove the cattle as far as they could so the animals would not try to return to the home range. The famous Chisholm Trail from Texas to Abilene, Kansas was 1,000 miles long. Day and night, for almost 3 months, cowboys worked to get the cattle to the market. Crossing rivers was only one of the dangers along the way. In Indian Territory, the Indians had the right to charge a toll. If the trail boss did not pay, the Indians would not let the cattle go through. Sometimes they would stampede the herd, sending the wild and frightened animals running away from the trail. And some very small thing could cause a stampede: lightning, strange smell, or lighting of a match. Prairie fires were often started by cattle thieves who were called rustlers. While cowboys put out the fire, the rustlers would capture as many stampeding cattle as they could. At sundown, the cattle were sent off the trail to graze. Then they settled down for the night. Every cowboy took a turn on watch. 2 or 3 cowboys usually worked together, circling the herd for about 2 hours. The cowboys often sang songs to quiet the herd and make the night watch less lonesome. Once the herd was quiet, the cook prepared the outfit's night meal. The chuck wagon held all the food, cooking utensils, and extra supplies for the drive. The Chisholm Trail ended at the cow town of Abilene. From there, the railroad took the cattle to the cities in the east. By this time, most of the cowboys were eager to get into town, but they had to hold the cattle a few miles outside of Abilene until the stockyards were clear of other herds. Cattle buyers from the east often came to look the cattle over. In the early days of the Chisholm Trail, the cowboys who drove the cattle to the market also loaded them onto trains. The cattle did not like being forced into stuffy boxcars. The men had to use long, pointy poles to hurry the mooing and angry cattle along. That is how cowboys came to be called cowpokes or cowpunchers. In just 5 years, more than 1 million head of cattle came up the Chisholm Trail to Abilene. Soon the town began to receive more cattle than it could handle. People who lived there did not like the cowboys. When the railroad was extended farther west to the Dodge City, the center of the cattle trade was moved west too. By the time all the work was done, the cowboys were ready for fun, but after 3 months on the trail, they were dirty and badly in need of a shave and a haircut. Their clothes were torn and worn out. With their pay in hand, cowboys went to a rooming house for a bath. Then they bought new clothes and visited the barber. Though the cowboys were not allowed to carry their 6-shooters in town, they often became rowdy, drinking too much whiskey and starting fights. The townspeople tried to put an end to their drunkenness and misbehavior. After a while, they had to hire town marshals to keep the peace. Many people became famous during the days of cowboys. Charles Goodnight, who had once been a cowboy himself, owned one of the largest cattle ranches in Texas. His wife, Mary Ann, was the only woman for hundreds of miles around his huge ranch. The Chisholm Trail was named after Jesse Chisholm, a well-known guide and trader. Joseph G. McCoy set up the town of Abilene. The Texas Rangers introduced the cowboys to the six-shooter. After fighting in the Texas War for Independence, the Texas Rangers became law enforcers in the West. Calamity Jane Canary, was tobacco-chewing, sharp-shooting pal to many of the cowboys. Buffalo Bill Cody started his career as a Pony Express rider. Later, he put together his touring Wild West show. Billy the Kid, Cole Yunker, Jesse James, and Belle Starr were all notorious outlaws. The cowboys who did not stay to work in Abilene usually took the train east to the Mississippi River. From there, they traveled south by steamboat. They might have spent all their money, but they still had their saddles and their gear. As soon as they were back in Texas, the cowboys usually signed up with a rancher to ride the trail again. That end.